are now in a position to fully understand, by contrast with the just explained process of healthy capital accumulation, what happens if investments are financed not by prior genuine savings, but by a process of artificial credit expansion, orchestrated by fractional reserve banks and directed by the lender of last resort, the so-called central bank. Unilateral credit expansion means that new loans are provided by banks and recorded in the asset side of their balance sheets against new demand deposits that are created out of thin air as collaterals of the new loans, and that are automatically recorded in the liability side of banks' balance sheets. So I give a loan to the rector, 1 million euros, and this is recorded in the asset side of my balance sheet. I am the banker. And the collateral is a deposit I create out of thin air that is included as an entry in the liability side of the balance sheet. So the loan in the asset against the deposit in the liability side, created out of thin air, just an entry in the accounting books of the bank. So new money, or I would better say new virtual money, because it only materializes in bank accounting book entries, is constantly created through this process of artificial credit expansion. And in fact, roughly, only around 10% of the monetary supply of most important economies is materialized in cash, either paper bills, banknotes, and coins. Being the remaining 90% of the monetary supply, this kind of virtual money that only exists as written entries in the bank books of accounting. Precisely, this is what the Spanish scholastics, I repeat, already called, more than 400 years ago, chirographis pecuniarum in Latin, or virtual money that only exists written, chirographis, in a book of accounting. It is easy to understand why credit expansions are so tempting and popular, and the way in which they entirely corrupt the behavior of the economic agents, deeply demoralizing society at all levels. First of all, entrepreneurs are usually very happy with credit expansions, as it seems as if any investment project, no matter how crazy it would appear in other situations, easily can get financing at very low interest rates. The money created through credit expansions is used by entrepreneurs to demand factors of production to be employed mainly in more distant from consumption capital good industries. As the process has not been triggered by an increase in savings, no productive resources are liberated from consumption industries, and the prices of commodities, factors of production, capital goods, and the titles that represent them in the stock markets substantially tend to grow, creating a market bubble. Everybody is happy, especially because it appears as if it would be possible to increase very easily one's wealth without any sacrifice in the form of prior savings and honest, hard individual work. The so-called virtuous circle of the new economy, in which recessions seemed to have been avoided forever, cheats all economic agents. Investors are very happy looking at the stock market quotations that grow day after day. Consumer goods industries are able to sell everything they carry to the market at ever-increasing prices. Restaurants, for instance, are always full with long waiting lists just to get a table. Workers and the unions see how desperately entrepreneurs demand their services in an environment of full employment, increasing wages, and immigration. Political leaders benefit from what appears to be an exceptionally good economic and social climate that they always sell to the electorate as the direct result of their leadership and good economic policies. State budget bureaucrats find astonished how every year public income to increase at double-digit figures, especially the proceeds coming from value-added tax, that although at the end is paid always by the final consumer, it is advanced by the entrepreneurs of the earliest stages, newly created and artificially financed through credit expansion. But we can now ask ourselves, for how long can this party last? For how long can continue the huge discoordination between the behavior of consumers that do not want to increase their savings and that of investors that constantly increase their investment financed by the artificial creation of virtual money by banks and not by the prior genuine savings of the citizens? For how long can last the illusion that everybody can get whatever he wants without any sacrifice? The unhampered market is a process, very dynamically efficient. And in fact, I've written a book entitled The Theory of Dynamic Efficient. Sooner or later, but in any case, inevitably, the market always discovers and tries to correct the huge errors committed. 6, take note of that, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 spontaneous macroeconomic reactions always developed, putting an end and reverting the negative effects of the bubble years financed by artificial bank credit expansion. Let us review those 6 effects. I study, as a matter of fact, with detail, the 6 spontaneous and inevitable microeconomic causes of the reversal of the artificial boom that the aggression of bank credit expansion invariably triggers in the market in my book on money, bank credit, and economic cycles. I'm very honored that this book has been translated into Romanian, thanks to the effort of Tudor Smirna and, of course, of the late Diana Costea, who passed away a few years ago and who I would like to mention here. And this book has been published by the Alexandru Ioan Fusal University with the title Moneda, Creditul Bancar și Ciclurile Economice. Happily, the roots of the Romanian language are exactly the same as the roots of the Spanish language. Let us summarize now these 6 effects that cause the reversal of the artificial boom. First one, take note, first effect. The rise in the price of the original means of production. I repeat, the rise in the price of the original means of production, mainly labor, natural resources, and commodities. This effect results when these resources have not been liberated from consumer goods industries because savings have not increased. And the entrepreneurs of the different stages in the production process compete with each other, demanding the original means of production with the newly created loans they have received from the banking system. Second effect, the subsequent rise in the price of consumer goods, even at a quicker pace than the rise of the pace of the factors of production. The subsequent rise in the price of consumer goods, second effect. This happens when time preference remains stable and the new money created by banks reaches the pockets of the consumers in an environment in which entrepreneurs frantically try to produce more for distant consumption and less for immediate consumption of all kinds of goods. And this second effect also explains the third one, which is the third effect, the substantial relative increase in the accounting profits of companies closest to final consumption, especially comparing with the profits of capital goods industries, which begin to stagnate when their costs rise more rapid than they turn over. The fourth effect is the recovery effect, which now exerts an impact which is exactly the opposite of the one it exerted when there was an increase in voluntary saving, and I just explained a few minutes ago. Now, the relative rise in the prices of consumer goods or of consumer industries turned over in an environment of increased productivity, with respect to the increase in original factor income, begins to drive down real wages, motivating entrepreneurs to substitute cheaper labor for machinery, which lessens the demand for capital goods and further reduces the profits of companies operating in the stages further from consumption. The fifth effect is the increase in the loan rate of interest, even exceeding pre-credit expansion levels. This happens when the pace of credit expansion stops accelerating, something that sooner or later always happens. The interest rates significantly increase due to the higher purchasing power and risk premiums demanded by the lenders. Furthermore, entrepreneurs involved in malinvestments start a fight to the death to obtain additional financing to try to complete their investment projects. And these 5 factors provoke the following and last 6th combined effect. The 6th effect is that companies which operate in the stages relatively more distant from consumption begin to discover they are incurring in heavy accounting losses. And these accounting losses, when compared with the relative profits generated in the stages closest to consumption, finally reveal beyond all doubt that serious entrepreneurial errors have been committed, and the urgent need to correct them by paralyzing and liquidating the investment projects mistakenly launched during the boom years. The financial crisis begins the moment the market, which, as I said, is very dynamically efficient, discovers that the true market value of the loans granted by banks during the boom is only a fraction of what was originally thought. In other words, the market discovers that the value of the bank assets is much less than previously thought, and as the bank liabilities, which are the deposits created during the boom, remain constant, the market discovers the banks are in fact bankrupt. And were not for the desperate action of the lender of last resort, bailing out the banks, the whole financial and monetary system would collapse. In any case, it is important to understand that the financial and banking crisis is not the cause of the economic recession, but one of its most important first symptoms. Economic recessions begin when the market discovers that many investment projects launched during the boom years are not profitable. And now consumers demand entrepreneurs to liquidate these malinvestments, which now it is discovered were planned to mature in a too distant future, considering the true wishes of consumers. The recession means the beginning of the painful readjustment of the productive structure, which consists of withdrawing productive resources from the stages farthest from consumption and transferring back to those closest to it. Both the financial crisis and the economic recession are always unavoidable once a credit expansion has developed, because the market sooner or later discovers that investment projects financed by banks during the boom were too ambitious due to a lack of the real safe resources that would be needed to complete them. In other words, bank credit expansion during the boom encourages entrepreneurs to act as if savings had increased, when in fact this did not happen. A generalized error of economic calculation has been committed, and sooner or later it is discovered and corrected spontaneously by the market. In fact, all the Austrian theory of economic cycles is a particular case of the theorem of the impossibility of economic calculation under socialism, discovered by Ludwig von Mises, that it is also fully applicable to the current wrongly designed and heavily regulated banking system. And now I'm going to make a few comments on the specific features of the current financial crisis and economic recession. The expansionary cycle, which has now come to a close, was set in motion when the American economy emerged from its last recession in 2001, and the Federal Reserve embarked again on a major artificial expansion of credit and investment, an expansion unbacked by a parallel increase in voluntary household savings. Even during several years, the monetary supply in the form of banknotes and deposits has grown at an average rate of over 10% per year, which means nothing more, nothing less, that every 7 years the total volume of money circulating in the world has doubled. The media of exchange originating from this severe fiduciary inflation have been placed on the market by the banking system as newly created loans granted at extremely low and even negative in real terms, interest rates. This has fueled a speculative bubble in the shape of a substantial rise in the prices of capital goods, real estate assets, and the securities which represent them and are exchanged on the stock market, where indexes, as you remember, sold. Curiously enough, like in the roaring years prior to the Great Depression of 1929, the shock of monetary growth has not significantly influenced the unit prices of the subset of consumer goods and services, which, as a matter of fact, are only approximately 1/3 of the total number of goods that are exchanged in the market, the other 2/3 being mainly capital goods. The last decade, like the 1920s, has seen a remarkable increase in productivity as a result of the introduction on a massive scale of new technologies and significant entrepreneurial innovations, which, were it not for the money and credit injection, would have given rise to a healthy and sustained reduction in the unit price of the goods and services all citizens consume. Moreover, the full incorporation of the economies of China and India into the globalized market has gradually raised the real productivity of consumer goods and services even further. The absence of a healthy deflation in the prices of consumer goods in a stage of such considerable growth in productivity as that of recent years provides the main evidence that the monetary shock has seriously disturbed the whole economic process. And remember now the anti-deflationist hysteria of those who, even during the years of the bubble, used the slightest symptoms of this healthy deflation to justify even greater doses of credit expansion. As we have already seen, artificial credit expansion and the fiduciary inflation of media of exchange offer no shortcut to a stable and sustained economic development. No way of avoiding the necessary sacrifice and discipline behind all high rates of voluntary saving. In fact, before the crisis, in particular in the United States, voluntary saving not only failed to increase, but even fall to a negative rate during several years, the bubble years. The specific triggers of the end of the euphoric monetary binge and the beginning of the recessionary hangover are many, and they can vary from one cycle to another. In this crisis, precisely the most obvious triggers were, first, the rise in the price of commodities and raw materials. Remember what happened with the price of oil just before the financial crisis. Second, the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States. And finally, the failure of important banking institutions when it became clear in the market that the value of their debts exceeded that of their assets, which were mainly mortgage loans erroneously granted. If we consider the level of past credit expansions and the quality and volume of malinvestment produced by it, very probably in this cycle, the economies of the European Monetary Union are in comparison in a somewhat less poor state. If we do not consider now the relatively greater continental European rigidities, particularly in the labour market, which tend to make recessions in Europe longer and more painful. The expansionary policy of the European Central Bank, though not free of grave errors, has been somewhat less irresponsible than that of the Federal Reserve. Furthermore, fulfillment of the convergence criteria for the monetary union involved at the time a healthy and significant rehabilitation of the chief European economies. Only some countries in the periphery, like Ireland and Spain, were immersed in considerable credit expansion from the time they initiated their processes of convergence. And the case of Spain is paradigmatic. The Spanish economy underwent an economic boom, which of course in part was due to real causes. For instance, the liberalizing structural reforms which began with José María Aznar's administration. Nevertheless, the boom was also largely fueled by an artificial expansion of money and credit, which grew in Spain at a rate nearly 3 times the corresponding rates in France and Germany. For instance, the M3 in Europe was growing at around an average 7%, But this was not evenly distributed. It was growing at 14–50% in Ireland and Spain, and only at 3–4% in France and Germany. The Spanish economic agents essentially interpreted the decrease in interest rates, which resulted from the convergence process, in the easy money terms traditionally in Spain. A greater availability of easy money and mass requests for loans from Spanish banks, mainly to finance real estate speculations. Loans which Spanish banks granted by creating the money ex nihilo, while European central bankers looked on unperturbed. Once the crisis has hit Spain, the readjustment has been quick and efficient. In less than a year, more than 150,000 companies, mainly related with the building sector, have disappeared in my country. Almost 5 million workers that were employed in the wrong sectors have been dismissed. And nowadays, we can conclude that, although very weak, the economic body of Spain has been already hailed. We will come back later to the economic policy more appropriate for the current circumstances. But before that, let us make some comments on the influence of the new accounting rules on the current economic and financial crisis. Especially because most of you are students of business administration and are studying a lot of classes of accounting. What's my opinion on the new accounting rules? We must not forget that the central feature of the long past period of artificial expansion was a gradual corruption on the American continent, as well as in Europe, of the traditional principles of accounting practiced globally for centuries. To be specific, acceptance of the international accounting standards and their incorporation into law in most countries have meant the abandonment of the traditional principle of prudence and its replacement by the principle of fair value. Look at the tricky here. Who is going to be against something fair? Fair value in the assessment of the value of balance sheet assets, particularly financial assets. In fact, during the years of the speculative bubble, this process was characterized by a feedback loop. Rising stock market values were immediately entered into the books, and then such accounting entries were sought as a justification for further artificial increases in the prices of financial assets listed on the stock market. It is easy to realize that the new accounting rules act in a pro-cyclic manner by heightening volatility and erroneously biasing business management. In times of prosperity, they create a false wealth effect, which prompts people to take disproportionate risks. When from one day to the next, the errors committed come to light, the loss in the value of assets immediately decapitalizes companies, which are obliged to sell assets and attempt to recapitalize at the worst moment, where assets are worth the least and financial markets dry up. Clearly, accounting principles which have proven so disturbing must be abandoned as soon as possible, and the recent accounting reforms recently enacted must be reversed. This is so not only because these reforms mean a dead end in a period of financial crisis and recession, but especially because it is vital that in periods of prosperity we stick to the principles of prudence in valuation, a principle which has shaped all accounting systems from the time of Luca Pacioli at the beginning of the 15th century to the adoption of the false idol of the international accounting rules. It must be emphasized that the purpose of accounting is not to reflect supposed real values, which in any case are subjective and which are determined and vary daily in the corresponding markets, under the pretext of obtaining a poorly understood accounting transparency. Instead, the purpose of accounting is to permit the prudent management of each company and to prevent capital consumption, as Hayek already established as early as 1934 in his article, The Maintenance of Capital. And this requires the application of strict standards of accounting conservatism, based on the prudence principle and the recording of either historical cost or market value, whichever is less. Standards which ensure at all times that distributable profits come from a safe surplus, which can be distributed without in any way endangering the future viability and capitalization of each corporation. And now we can ask ourselves also the following question. Who is responsible for the current situation we all are suffering? That's a very important question. Of course, the spontaneous order of the market is not responsible for the current situation. And one of the most difficult consequences of a very past crisis, and of course of this current one, is how many people is blaming the market and firmly believing that the recession is a market failure that requires more government intervention. Completely wrong idea. The market is a process that spontaneously reacts in the way we have seen against the monetary aggression of the bubble years, which consisted of a huge credit expansion that was not only allowed but even orchestrated and directed by central banks, which are the true responsible institutions for all the economic sufferings of the crisis and recession that is affecting the world. I try to stress this point because it's very difficult to read that in the media. It's not considered to be politically correct. Something unbelievable. And paradoxically, look at that. Paradoxically, central banks have been able to present themselves to the general public not only as indignant victims of the long list of ad hoc scapegoats they have been able to put together. For instance, stupid private bankers, greedy managers, receiving exorbitant bonuses, and so on. But also as the only institution that bailing out the banking system in the last resort has avoided a much more deep tragedy. Anyhow, it is crystal clear that the world monetary and banking system is chronically suffering from a wrong institutional design, at least from Peel's Bank Act of 1844. That there is not a free market in the monetary and banking system, but just the opposite. Private money, let us think if there is a free market in the financial area. Let us review the current situation of the design of the financial system. First, private money has been nationalized. Is this something typical of a free market? Second, legal tender rules have been introduced. Third, a huge mess of administrative regulations are constantly enacted by central banks. Fourth, interest rates are constantly manipulated by central banks. And most importantly, everything is directed by a central organ of monetary planning, like the old Gosplan in the Soviet Union, the so-called central bank. In other words, what I'm trying to explain, real socialism, represented by state money, central banks, and financial administrative regulations, is still in force in the monetary and credit sectors of the so-called free market economies. And as a result of this fact, we experience regularly in the area of money and credit all the negative consequences established by the theory of the impossibility of socialism that was discovered by those distinguished members of the Austrian School of Economics. I've already mentioned Ludwig von Mises. We should add also to Friedrich Hayek. Specifically, the central planners of the state money are not able to know, to follow, and to control the changes in both the demand and supply of money. Furthermore, as we have seen, the whole financial system is based on the legal privilege given by the state to private bankers to act with a fractional reserve ratio in relation with demand deposits, the demand deposits they receive from their clients. As a result of this privilege, private bankers are not true financial intermediaries, but are mainly creators of deposits, materializing in credit expansions that inevitably end in crisis and recession. The most rigorous economic analysis and the coolest, most balanced interpretation of past and recent economic and financial events lead inexorably to the conclusion that central banks, which again are true financial central planning agencies, cannot possibly succeed in finding the most convenient monetary policy at every moment. And this is exactly the kind of problem that became evident in the case of the failed attempts to plan the former Soviet economy from above. To put it another way, the figuring of the economic impossibility of socialism is fully applicable to central banks in general, and to the Federal Reserve, and at one time Alan Greenspan, and currently Ben Bernanke in particular. According to this theorem, it is impossible to organize any area of the economy, and especially the financial sector, based on coercive commands issued by a planning agency, since such a body can never obtain the information it needs to infuse its commands with a coordinating nature. And this is precisely what I analyze in chapter 3 of my most recent book on socialism, economic calculation and entrepreneurship, which has just been published by Edward Elgar in association with the Institute of Economic Affairs. Indeed, nothing is more dangerous than to indulge in the fatal conceit, to use Hayek's useful expression, of believing oneself omniscient, or at least wise and powerful enough to be able to keep the most suitable monetary policy fine-tuned at all times. Hence, rather than soften the most violent ups and downs of the economic cycle, the Federal Reserve, and to a lesser extent the European Central Bank, have been the main architects and the culprits in the worsen. Therefore, the dilemma now affecting Bernanke and his Federal Reserve Board, as well as the other central banks, beginning with the European Central Bank, is not at all comfortable. For years they have shirked the monetary responsibility, and now they find themselves in a blind alley. They can either allow the recessionary process to follow its path, and with it the healthy and painful readjustment, or they can escape forward toward a renewed inflationist cure. And you see the two models, the model of Germany and the completely opposite model of the United States. With this model, American model of stimulus and renewed inflationist cure, the chances of even more severe recession, even inflationary recession, the so-called stagflation, in the not-so-distant future, increases dramatically. And this was precisely the error committed following the stock market crash of 1987, an error which led to the inflation of the end of the 1980s, that concluded with the sharp recession of 1990-1992. Furthermore, the introduction of the artificially cheap credit policy at this stage could only hinder the necessary liquidation of unprofitable investments and company reconversion. It could even wind up prolonging the recession indefinitely, as occurred in the Japanese economy. Is what I call the Japanization of an economy, which after all possible interventions have been tried, has ceased to respond to any stimulus involving either monetarist credit expansion or Keynesian methods. It is in this context of financial schizophrenia that we must interpret the shots in the dark filed in the last 2 years by the monetary authorities, who have two totally contradictory responsibilities. Shh! Hear me, do not speak, please. Who have two totally contradictory responsibilities, both to control inflation and to inject all the liquidity necessary into the financial system to prevent its collapse. Thus, one day, the Federal Reserve System rescues Bear Stearns, American International Group, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or Citigroup. And other day, it allows Lehman Brothers to fail under the amply justified pretext of teaching a lesson and refusing to fuel moral hazard. Finally, in light of the way events were unfolding, the Americans and the European governments launched a multi-billion-dollar plans to purchase illiquid, the so-called illiquid, no, it's better to say worthless, assets from the banking system, or to monetize the public debt, or even to buy bank shares, nationalizing totally or partially the private banking system. And considering all what we have seen, which are now the possible scenarios? Let us talk about the possible scenarios. What can happen? in the case of a crisis. Theoretically, under the broadly designed current financial system, once the crisis has hit, we can think of 4 possible scenarios. Let us review them. The first scenario is the catastrophic one, in which the whole banking system, based on fractional reserve, collapses. This scenario seems to have been avoided by central banks, which, acting as lenders of last resort, are bailing out private banks wherever it is necessary. The second scenario is just the opposite of the first one, but equally tragic. It consists of an inflationist cure so intense that a new bubble is created. This escape forward would only temporarily postpone the solution of the problems at the cost of making them far more serious later. The third scenario is what I have called the Japanization of the economy. It happens when the reintroduction of the cheap credit policy, together with all conceivable government interventions, entirely block the spontaneous market process of liquidation of unprofitable investments and company reconversion. As a result, the recession prolongs indefinitely, and the economy does not recover and ceases to respond to any stimulus involving monetarist credit expansions or Keynesian methods. And finally, the last scenario, the fourth one, is currently the most probable. It happens when the spontaneous order of the market, against all the odds and despite all government stupidities and interventions, finally, sooner or later, is able to complete the macroeconomic readjustment of the whole economy, and the necessary reallocation of labor and the other factors of production toward profitable lines based on sustainable new investment projects is culminated. In any case, after a financial crisis and an economic recession have hit, it is necessary to avoid, and now I'm going to review my policy prescriptions. It is necessary to avoid any additional credit expansion. Apart from the minimum monetary injection strictly necessary to avoid the collapse of the whole fractional reserve banking. And the most appropriate policy would be to liberalize the economy at all levels, especially in the labor market, to permit the rapid reallocation of productive factors, particularly labor, to profitable sectors. Likewise, it is essential to reduce public spending and taxes in order to increase the available income of heavily indebted economic agents who need to repay their loans as soon as possible. Economic agents, companies, families, only rehabilitate their finances by cutting costs, especially labor costs, and paying off loans. And essential to this aim are a very flexible labor market and a much more austere public sector. These measures are fundamental if the market is to reveal as quickly as possible the real value of the investment goods produced in error, and thus lay the foundation for a healthy, sustainable economic recovery. However, and this is the tragedy, once the economy recovers, and in a sense the recovery begins, remember when the crisis and the recession themselves, which mark the discovery by the market of the errors committed and the beginning of the necessary macroeconomic readjustment. I'm afraid, I say, that when the economy recovers, and as has happened in the past again and again, and no matter how careful are central banks in the future, can we expect they have learned the lesson? For how long they will keep their memories of what happened? No matter how many new regulations are enacted, as in the past, all of them, and especially Basel II, Basel III now, are only attacking the symptoms, but not the true causes of the whole problem. I am afraid that sooner or later, new cycles and credit expansions of artificial economic boom, financial crisis, and economic recession will inevitably continue affecting us until the world financial and banking system are entirely redesigned according to the general principles of private property law that are the essential foundation of the capitalist system and that require a 100% reserve for any demand deposit contracts. And now, I pass to the last part of my lecture, to the conclusion. I began this lecture with Bill's Bank Act. Remember it. And I will finish also with Bill's Bank Act. On June 13 and 24, 1844, Sir Robert Peel pointed out in the House of Commons that in each one of the previous monetary crises, I quote, there was an increase in the issues of country bank paper, and that currency without a basis only creates fictitious value, and when the bubble bursts, spreads ruin over the country and derages all commercial transactions. End of quote. Today, 166 years later, we are still suffering from the problems that were already correctly diagnosed by Robert Peel. And in order to solve them, and finally reach the only true, free and stable financial and monetary system that is compatible with a free market economy in this 21st century, it will be necessary to take the following 3 steps. First one, to develop and complete the basic concept of Peel's Bank Act, extending also the prescription of 100% reserve requirement to demand deposits and equivalents. Hayek says that this radical solution would prevent all future crises, as no credit expansion would be possible without a prior increase in real genuine saving, making investments sustainable and fully matched with prior voluntary savings. And I would add to Hayek the most important fact that 100% banking is the only one compatible with the general principles of law of property rights that are indispensable for the capitalist system to work. There is no reason to treat deposits of money differently from any other deposit of a fungible good, such as wheat or oil, in which nobody doubts the need to keep the 100% reserve requirement. In relation with this first step of the proposed reform, it is most encouraging to see how 2 Tory members of the British Parliament, Douglas Carswell and Steve Baker, were able to introduce in the British Parliament on September the 15th, just a month ago, and under the 10-minute rule, the first reading of a bill to reform the banking system, extending the prescriptions of Peel's Bank Act to demand deposits. They called to the bill the Customer Choice Disclosure and Protection Bill. And it will be discussed in its second reading 3 weeks from now, on November the 19th. It has 2 goals. First, to fully and effectively defend citizens' right of ownership over money they have deposited in checking accounts at banks. And second, to once and for all put an end to the recurrent cycles of artificial boom, financial crisis and economic recession. Of course, that this first draft of the bill still needs to be completed with some important details. For instance, the time period, let us say a month, under which all deposits should be considered demand deposits for storage and not for investment. Or that any contract that guarantees full availability of its nominal value at any moment should be considered at all effects as a demand deposit for storage. But the mere discussion of these matters at the British Parliament by the public at large is already of a huge importance. In any case, it is exciting that a handful of Tory members of the Parliament have taken this step against the tangle of vested interests related with the current privileged fractional reserve banking system. If they are successful in their fight against what we could call the current financial slavery that affects the world, they will go down in history like William Wilberforce with the abolition of the slave trade and other outstanding British figures to which the whole world owes so much. Second, which is the second proposal of banking reform. If we want to culminate the fall of the Berlin Wall, and this is especially important to be said here, in a former communist country like Romania. If we want to culminate the fall of the Berlin Wall and get rid of the real socialism that still remains in the monetary and credit sector, a priority would be the elimination of central banks, which would be unnecessary as lenders of last resort if the preceding 100% reserve reform is introduced, and harmful if they insist on continuing to act as financial central planning agencies. And third, who will issue the monetary base? Maurice Allais, and I would like to remember him because he passed away last week, the French Nobel Prize winner, proposed that the public agency prints the public paper money at a rate of increase of 2% per year. I personally do not trust in this solution, as any situation of emergency of the state budget would be used, as in the past, as a pretext to issue additional doses of fiduciary media. For this reason, and this is probably my most polemic proposal, to put an end to any future manipulation of our money by the authorities, what is required is the full privatization of the current monopolistic and fiduciary state issue paper-based money, and its replacement with a classic pure gold standard. By the way, the Arabs are already doing that. You can look at it in the internet. In order to boycott the use of dollars, they are beginning to exchange in Indonesia in gold. It's the only true honest money. So in this fight for honest money, I think we have as allies all the Arab world. There is an old Spanish saying, "A grandes males, grandes remedios, señor embajador." In English, great problems to require radical solutions. And although, of course, any step toward these three measures would significantly improve our current economic system, it must be understood that the reforms proposed and taken by governments up to now, including Basel I, Basel III, Solvency II, and so on, for banks, insurance companies, and so on, are only nervously attacking the symptoms, but not the real roots of the problem. And precisely for that reason, they will again miserably fail in the future. Meanwhile, it is encouraging to see how a growing number of scholars in private institutions, like the University, Romanian-American University, are studying again the only radical reforms required by a truly honest private money. But also very interesting proposal for a suitable transition to a new banking system, like the one I developed in chapter 9 of my book on money, bank rate, and economic cycles. By the way, and this is also a very important point, in this chapter I also explain a most interesting byproduct of the proposed reform, and that consists of the possibility of paying back without any cost nor inflationary effects most of the existing public debt, which in the current circumstances is a very worrying and increasing heavy burden in most countries. Briefly outline, this is only a byproduct, but of immense importance also. Briefly outline, what I propose, and for instance the Cogden Center has developed with detail, has put all the numbers for the specific case of the United Kingdom, discovered that the whole public debt of the United Kingdom could be paid back immediately without any cost nor inflationary effects. And do not laugh. Read about why that solution is possible. What in El Quijote, but this is not what in El Quijote was called the bálsamo de Fierabrás. Briefly outline, what I propose is to print the paper banknotes necessary to consolidate the volume of demand deposits that the public decides to keep in the banks. In any case, printing this new money would not be inflationary, as it would be handed to banks and kept entirely sterilized, so to speak, as 100% asset collateral of bank liabilities in the form of demand deposits. In this way, the basket of bank assets, loans, investments, and so on, that are currently backing the demand deposits would be freed. And what I propose is to include these freed assets in mutual funds, swapping the units at their market value, of course, by the outstanding treasury bonds. In any case, an important warning must be given. Naturally, it must never, I must never be tired of repeating it. The solution proposed is only valid in the context of an irrevocable decision to re-establish a free banking system subject to a 100% reserve requirement on demand deposits. However, and no matter how important this possibility is considered under the current circumstances, we must not forget it is only a byproduct of secondary importance, comparing with the major reform of the banking system we have outlined. And now I finish. Should in this 21st century a new Robert Peel would be able to push successfully all these proposed reforms, he would render an invaluable service to the rest of the world. All these considerations are crucially important in light of the critical state of the international financial system. Nevertheless, while it is tragic that we have arrived at the current situation, it is even more tragic, if possible, the widespread lack of understanding regarding the causes of the phenomena that plague us, and especially the atmosphere of confusion and uncertainty prevalent among experts, analysts, and most economic theorists. In this area, at least, I can hope that the different editions of my book on money, bank rate, and economic cycles may contribute to the theoretical training of the readers, to the intellectual rearmament of the new generations, of the young people as you, and eventually to the so much needed institutional redesign of the entire monetary and financial system of current market economies. If this hope is fulfilled, I will not only view the effort made as worthwhile, but will also think it a great honor to have contributed, even in a very small way, to move in the right direction. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you very much, Mr. De Soto. If you have some question, Professor De Soto will respond. Please, my colleagues will help you with some microphones.
First, thank you very much for being with us here. It was very helpful to hear the causes of this economic depression now. But would you think that such a radical reform you're suggesting based on such discovered causes would be ever possible without any concept or control from other social factors? Do you think that it can be possible only to have a radical reform only in the economic sector without entangling the collaterals? That would be very significant. Thank you.
Well, I'm a professor, a university professor. I'm interested in theory, but ideas move long-term practical decisions. If we begin to understand what is happening, the real causes of what happened, more than 50% of the way has been done. This is the important point, and we are in a university environment. Apart from that, I will tell you that the reform of the financial system is not going to be hard. The abolition of trade slavery. I recommend you, to all of you, to see the movie Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace is the title of the movie. Could you say with hand who has seen the movie? Any of you has seen the movie Amazing Grace? Well, if I were a professor in this university, I will order you for this next weekend to see the movie. Well, it took all his life to William Wilberforce to reach the goal of eliminating the trade of slaves. All the odds were against him. When he introduced his bill the first time, all members of the parliaments were either directly or indirectly related with the slave trade. It took him 25 years.
the vested interests of the financial system are huge, but not greater than what we could see with the slave trade. At the end of the movie, by the way, there is a movie moment when the bill is passed 25 years later, and everybody, even the members of the opposition, stand up to congratulate William Wilberforce, including the cousin of the king, who was the most important slave trader of those days. So, if we look at the past, the future is ours. Yeah? You should be an enthusiast and pushing for the reform, no matter how the difficulties you think are going to be.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think the technological level of advancement of humanity would have been after 160 years of 100% banking and of very safe investment, conducting business? Thank you.
Innovation is a very important force in the development of a free market, but always within the framework of the general principles of law. If we have the ideas clearly in our mind, all innovations regarding the monetary transactions and so on will be most welcome, but provided that the main features of the legal framework needed, that the free market economy needs, are kept or maintained. If you are suggesting the objection I have been receiving sometimes, that it is impossible to keep the 100% reserve requirement regarding all the possible future innovations, well, this is not a true objection. It's like objecting, oh, so you say that putting poison and killing a person is a crime. What is going to happen with all the innovations in the future, with new poisons that nobody can discover? Even if this happens, we still will know forever in the future that put poison and killing a man or a woman is a crime.
Thank you. Next.
You have talked about the Ricardo effect. Is this a solution for labor market? Real solution?
Sorry, the solution for labor markets what?
Ricardo effect.
No, the Ricardo effect is not a solution for anything. It's just an effect discovered by Hayek. In fact, some scholars have renamed it as the Hayek effect, that explains in which way the increases or decreases in savings and also in the prices of consumer goods affects labor. Hayek says that the best test of a good economist is to understand that demand for consumers does not mean demand for labor. Demand for consumer goods does not mean demand for labor. In fact, if the demand for consumer goods increases, it affects the long-term capital good industries, and overall it affects the labor market. So this is only an analytical tool to interpret and to understand what could happen, either in the case, as I said at the beginning, of true genuine savings, or in the case of artificial credit expansion. The causes of unemployment can be divided in two general chapters, in two general types. Of course, there is a short-term cause or an immediate cause, which is that the labor markets are not free. And as a matter of fact, the last three Nobel Prize winners in economics have been discussing in which way the rigidities introduced in the free market by the authorities, labor regulations, and so on, unemployment subsidies, do in fact increase unemployment. But they didn't mention the most important mediate, not short-term or immediate, but mediate cause of unemployment, which is credit expansion. In which way? Artificial credit expansion do reallocate thousands and thousands of workers in unsustainable investment projects. When the market sooner or later discovers that, all of a sudden it is necessary to reallocate these hundreds of thousands of employees to profitable lines. And if the market is not very flexible, this creates a huge suffering and takes a long of time. So anyone interested in having full employment should be an ally against the fractional reserve artificial credit expansion system.
Mihai, I'm a money and credit researcher. I'm wondering, what do you think about the following fact? The reaction of the Spanish government and the reaction, more important, the reaction of the Spanish central banks in relation with your issues. They have something to answer you. This is the first question. And the second, back to one of the most important questions that you raise. Who is responsible for the current situation? The normal answer, central banks. But what is behind the scene? The central banks, we know that they are formal institutions. What about the informal institution that acts in the symbolic economy and the real economy, and do you think that can be responsible for that? Thank you.
Those are important questions. Beginning with the second one, there is a symbiosis between central bankers, private bankers, politicians. It's a huge tangle of vested interests. Everything is fed by the idea that it is possible, this is the fatal conceit mentioned by Hayek, that it is possible to make a kind of social engineering on the financial arena so that these artificial expansions can be controlled by central banks in order not to create bubbles and economic crisis and recession. Precisely for that reason, I do consider my book on money as a special chapter of my research on the impossibility of socio-economic calculation under socialism. The effects we are suffering in the financial area of the so-called free market economies are exactly the same effects you were suffering up to 20 years ago in Romania. So remember all the stupidities and things and all the lies and all the contradictions of the former Soviet economy you were suffering up to 1989. This is exactly the same we are suffering in the financial area in the rest of the world. Exactly, there are no qualitative difference in the analysis, not in the conclusions. You are a especially good set of people to understand what we are explaining. Because when I explain these things in France, England, Spain, is they've been not suffering communism. They think that state money, central planning agencies like central banks and so on are the normal thing for life. You should explain them why they are not compatible with the free market economy. Regarding your question regarding the Spanish, what exactly what's my opinion of the reaction of the central bank to the crisis?
Yeah. They react in a way in relation with these issues.
Well, it's curious. In relative terms, the Spanish banking industry up to now has suffered less than the other European countries because even with the new accounting regulations, they were allowed to keep additional provisions in a very conservative way that have acted as an additional cushion. And those provisions were not available in the other countries, like Netherlands, England, and so on. So in this aspect, the Central Bank of Spain was a little bit more conservative. Several high officials of the Central Bank of Spain are my pupils. In fact, one of them has just read his doctoral thesis on how to reach a true stable international monetary system. So they know what I'm talking about, and my book is one of the bestsellers in Spain. Although officially they do not pronounce themselves. I'm very proud that my prescriptions were followed by British people, but as we say in Spanish, nadie es profeta en su tierra. Nobody is a good prophet in his own land. but let us...
More questions?
Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto. My name is Christina, and 1 year ago I was hearing the Barack Obama telling us that a solution for going out of the crisis is to consume. But today I was hearing you telling us that saving money, it could be a solution, a real one. So
that's very important. You know, one of the stupidities that, well, I wouldn't say that. in one time, our Prime Minister said is that in order to obtain the recovery as soon as possible, it was needed to increase consumption. Fortunately, nobody followed that advice. What all companies and families are doing is to increase savings, not consumption. If you increase consumption in a crisis, it's like trying to put an egg into a fire with more fire. Take into account that most of the people is employed, around 4/5 of all the workers are employed not in consumption good industries, but in industries that are producing goods that will only mature in consumption goods 5 years from now, 4 years from now, and those are the companies that desperately need the financing coming from savings. So the only way to begin the recovery, sustainable recovery, is to decrease consumption and to increase savings. And this is what spontaneously most corporations and families are doing. And I explained the theoretical reasons of that just a few moments ago. The theoretical reasons why the so-called paradox, Keynesian paradox of thrift is entirely wrong.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to put the following question. You mentioned that during the crisis it would be good to have the taxes go down. Such a solution goes against the present trend in the world. All governments are trying to increase the taxes, which is the case also in Romania. At the same time, in Romania, the decided by the central bank is an opinion that the taxes must not be touched during the period of time. Which are your arguments to decrease the taxes in such a period? And also, I have another question. Usually, when people are speaking about the activity in a bank, they are speaking about the risks and the risk management. You never mention such a subject, except when you make the reference to part 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Well, I will give you the second. This is a very important point, because apart from a professor of political economy, I'm a specialist in actuarial matters. I'm an actuarial scientist specializing in insurance. There is a huge difference between risk and uncertainty. Risk refers to a knowledge that you can get about the behavior of a set of homogeneous elements. And this can be insured. You can apply all the field of mathematical probabilities and so on. Uncertainty refers to the field of human action, which means that every human endeavor, like a company, corporation, an investment decision and so on, is a unique historical event. There is no a set of homogeneous elements, of homogeneous phenomena. So you cannot apply probability theory to uncertain single events, especially because the future in economics and in human action is not something given already there, that we are just waiting for it to come. The future is something that must be created anew every morning by all of you acting or not acting. So the future is not given as all mainstream mathematical economists do think when they put T1, T2, T3, the variables, to make their general equilibrium models dynamic, which is a huge contradiction. Where is a dynamic general equilibrium model? To talk about the dynamic general equilibrium model is like talking about a square circle or hot snow or a one-ton virgin, says Anthony de Soto. Stupidity. When they think they have included in the mathematical models time, they just are including a specialized concept of time. The future is there and we are only waiting for it to come. It's like the sun. The sun will appear tomorrow. We can predict with less than a second of difference when the sun will be appearing tomorrow here in Bucharest. But the sun is not in the field of human action. In the field of human action, we cannot make any specific predictions, because what will happen will depend on the information we will create anew as entrepreneurs tomorrow. We can only make pattern predictions, what can you call pattern predictions, that are like theoretical predictions. The bad effects of intervention of the government in the free market, and period. Cannot make any other thing. So, all the goal of Basel II, Basel III is based on the assumption that we can manage in a scientific way the so-called financial risks, operational risks, credit risks, and so interest risk and so on. This is entirely without any scientific basis. So the whole regulation lacks any scientific foundation. And it is really, in fact, really dangerous, because the managers do think they are able to scientifically manage the financial sector, and the central bankers think they can control the whole thing, and the whole building of Basel II and III will collapse in the next financial crisis, because they are attacking only the symptoms, not the true causes, and the scientific body used to try to reach their goals is baseless from the point of view of economic theory. Those are not risks, those are uncertainties. And the switch in paradigm is very easy. For 200 years in the insurance sector, insurance companies were accepting risks, true risks, because they have mortality tables and so on, and could calculate the premiums. But the insurance company was in fact a human action outcome. And managers were acting in a very conservative way, following principles. Now, the paradigm is changed. From the former behavior following principles, now we change to a new paradigm. That means you can do whatever you want, provided that you have enough capital. And please calculate if you have enough capital using Basel II, Basel III, Solvency II, and so on, and those formulas. And this is extremely harmful for the future of the free market, because we, as entrepreneurs, act in a world of pure, ineradicable uncertainty, and the only way to cope with this uncertainty is acting, basing our behavior on principles, not on the social engineering of risks. The other question was related taxes, no? Yes, of course. When the economic recession comes, the public expenditures increases. For instance, in Spain, to pay the unemployment insurance of 5 million unemployed. What I am prescribing is that the public sector should be much more austere in order to avoid huge increases in public deficits. And what is more important, the need to increase taxes that do not have, in fact, a very significant effect in the final increases of public income. Fortunately, most countries are attacking the side of expenses. either if they are Greece, Spain, Ireland, and so on. In Spain, some taxes were increased. Mainly, the value-added tax was increased 2 points, from 16% to 18%. And now it has been announced an increase in income taxes for the rich people, but this is only a gift to the leftists that say that the efforts and the sacrifice must be more equally distributed among everybody.
Thank you. The last question. Here.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Professor. My question will be from a different angle. You mentioned the fractionary reserves and the policies of the central banks and so on. The question is like that. The fractionary reserves and all the decisions of the central banks were not made by mistake. We cannot imagine that in a total consensus all these entities acted wrongly in the same direction. So one question is more rhetorical, is they did that because they made a mistake or they were following a certain target. And we can add to that, is this crisis an accident or an instrument? Thank you.
Well, of course, this crisis is not an accident. It's a repetition of what has been affecting the world since at least Pilsbank Act. And precisely to illustrate this truth is why I began my lecture referring to Pilsbank Act. Robert Peel was describing exactly the same phenomena we are now suffering. And he was able to diagnose correctly the true cause of the phenomena, but he was not able to complete his legislation to include also demand deposits. And now we can understand the logic of the evolution from then until now. It is incredible. It's a matter of fact that the fate of the whole world depends on, is the result of an incident, historical incident, committed 166 years ago. And you mentioned, they were conscious, they were doing wrongly. I also tried to explain in my lecture that all interests are vested in the bubble years to keep the party on. Even if you know that at the end you are going to have a huge crisis, no central banker dares to stop it and be condemned as the one who began a crisis. In this aspect, it was extremely harmful, a book written by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz entitled Monetary History of the United States, one of the most harmful books written in economics after the general theory of Keynes. Because the story of this book is that the Great Depression was caused by an error of the central bank that did not inject enough doses of money after the crash of the market in 1929. What is the conclusion then of the book? Hey, you central banks, whenever you believe to see the first symptom of a crisis, must inject more money, more money, more money. And this is what central bankers are doing, and that explains why they, even Alan Greenspan was saying, you know, now being 90-year-old, it is impossible to realize if we are in a bubble. It is impossible to prevent a bubble. So nobody can understand what is happening. I was joking yesterday in the meal that Rector offered me that I think God is very good. The misericordia of God is infinite, and He can accept everybody with the exception of Alan Greenspan that will go to hell. And I would include also Krugman. Thank you. Please do not tell that.
Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And of course, thank you very much again, Professor De Soto. If you don't mind, you'll be in charge of this. But I think it's necessary to stay on That side, yeah, because they will move here and they'll make some pictures for you. Yeah? Okay. Oh, wait, another second. Yeah.
Un moment,
Okay.
one moment.
One moment. Okay. Everybody's here.
So what should I do to... So it is a great honor to inaugurate the Rothbard Center of the Romanian-American University.
Hai că nu scriu, ne întâlnim acolo la Marea, hai că vine să te